Hello and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Welcome to the Books on Asia podcast. I'm your host, Amy Chavez, and our guest today is author Lesley Downer. Lesley is an expert on Japanese culture and history. Her novels transport readers to the intriguing world of 19th century Japan, while her nonfiction takes the reader along on the narrow road to the deep north, following in the footsteps of poet Matsuo Basho, as well as behind the scenes of the Japanese geisha community and behind the richest family in Japan. Her latest book, released in July, is The Shortest History of Japan, From Mythical Origins to Pop Culture Powerhouse. We are so honored to have Lesley on the podcast today.
Hi, thank you very much. It's great to be on Books for Asia.
Thank you so much. And I have to tell you about how I found your latest book, which was just released in July, right? It's called The Shortest History of Japan, From Mythical Origins to Pop Culture Powerhouse. I was in Australia. Have you ever heard of the Asian Book Room in the ACT? The Australian Capital Territory?
No.
It's amazing. And they have all these rare books and older books and out of print books. And I spent like a couple hours in there. And I went up to the cashier, to the cash register, and they had this stack of your book. And I thought, Lesley Downer, oh my gosh, I have to have that. And I started reading it and I really, really enjoyed it. And I'll tell you why. First of all, it's just to explain to our listeners, it's a summary of Japanese history, which is pretty difficult to do because it's quite long and complicated. So you didn't have many pages really to talk about everything. You had to do it quickly but thoroughly. And that in itself is a true art. But what you did so well was connect the event. It just little connections that I had never really thought about before. I thought that was so well done. For example, in a book on Japanese history, usually there will be a chapter on the samurai. And of course, everyone knows about the samurai, so it just jumps in with the samurai. Your book tells us how the samurai developed and why. And there are just so many little gems like that in there.
So when I was writing it, I really wanted it to be history as story. And also, I love the characters in Japanese history. I'm in love with Yoshitsune. I'm in love with Oda Nobunaga. I don't know he was a bad guy, but I'm still in love with him. I love the stories. And I really wanted to bring out the personalities and the stories and the chain of cause and effect. I thought that was really important. I mean, I think other history books tend to say, well, this happened on this date, and then this else happened on this date. But I thought the whole point is, why did it happen? Why did this lead to that?
Yes, I think you did a great job of doing that. I would like to start at the beginning with our shamaness Himiko.
Yeah.
And what an interesting figure. And, ancient Japan was full of these very powerful women. After Himiko, of course, there were 7 or so empresses, right? And so Himiko, this is the 1st century, right? AD. So could you tell us a bit about her?
So basically, Japan was lots of kind of wars between chiefdoms. And Himiko was brought to power and she somehow unified the kingdom of Yamatai. So she was chosen because she was a shamaness. And obviously, shamanesses are very powerful. They can be powerful in temporal terms, but they're also powerful in relation to the gods. So she had the strength and the power to bring the kingdom of Yamatai together under her rule. So all that warfare stopped. So she brought about peace. And she's known about from the Chinese annals. She's not known from Japanese sources. And the Chinese said that she occupied herself with magic and sorcery, bewitching the people. And thereupon they placed her upon the throne. Well, that could have been a bit of male chauvinism, that she was placed on the throne because she bewitched the people. But in any case, she definitely became queen. She was only about 20. And she lived in a palace where she kept herself hidden, a bit like, I think, like the emperor today. She was not out and about. The temporal work was done by her younger brother. For example, met up with the Chinese envoys and took envoys to the Chinese Empire, which was the powerful empire of the time. Her primary job officially was really intervening with the gods. So it was making sure that the food supply was maintained, making sure that there were good harvests, making sure that the weather was good. But she also had temporal power. She also issued laws. It was said she was a stern ruler. This is what the Chinese annals said. I thought perhaps she conducted rituals, perhaps like the Daijosai. There's one Japanese movie, which admittedly is somewhat after the time of Himiko being a movie, but it shows her as having sex with the sun goddess, which strikes me as somewhat unlikely, but you never know. I mean, it could be basically the sort of ritual that you have in Shinto, which is pretty, extraordinary to this day, perhaps originated from the time of Himiko or before, or from Jomon times.
Didn't you say in the book that she had like 1,000 attendants and only one of them was male?
Yes, that's right. So it was a whole kind of gathering of women in this palace of hers. And the job of the one male was to sort of serve her, I understand. She ruled for 60 years. And so she maintained peace for 60 years. She was clearly an awe-inspiring presence.
Mm-hmm.
She probably dressed, you can tell this from the haniwa. She probably wore, a long tunic-like garment, long skirts under that. I mean, garments not radically different from modern Japanese dress in some ways, but a sort of obi around her waist and fairly full sleeves, maybe a sort of osode, as it were, on the outside and a kosode on the inside of that. And she probably had her hair in loops. People have been able to discover quite a lot. Archaeologists have discovered quite a lot of how she may have dressed. So it's not just the haniwa, it's also what's been discovered in the way of artifacts. So she probably had a gold crown. She probably had gold earrings. Also, it's known that the Emperor of China sent her white silk and brocade of blue and crimson. So she wore garments like that. I mean, there was a lot of silk weaving going on. So there was wonderful, there were wonderful fabrics being produced. And as the queen, she would have worn the most magnificent fabrics.
And she probably lived in Kyushu?
That's not known.
Oh, really?
Either northern Kyushu or Nara, the Nara area. Quite possibly Nara. Her tomb, which was absolutely enormous, and it's said that she went to her death with either 100 or 1,000 living attendants who were buried with her. Now, apparently, archaeologists have found no evidence of human sacrifice. So maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. But anyway, that is what is said in the Chinese annals. Again, you have to remember that this is the Chinese interpretation and the Chinese telling of stories. And they weren't particularly concerned with accuracy. So they were telling
good story.
All sorts of stories. It's very interesting what the Chinese have to say. I mean, they said that the people covered themselves in tattoos, which was to protect themselves against dangerous fish when they were diving for food, and that people were very well behaved, and it was a hierarchical society. So the lower orders would actually step off the path when somebody of the higher orders went by. And we also know that they had slaves, because Himiko's envoy to the Emperor of China included, I think, six women and 4 men, who are, again, they're just part of, they're like merchandise. They're not described as human beings. But so there was slavery. So a lot of this we know from the Chinese annals. We also know what the houses are like from archaeology. So her palace was probably made of wood. Perhaps, I think there's been reconstructions made. It might have been roofed like a gashozukuri with a sort of steep roof, that sort of building. So we can actually imagine in quite a lot of detail what it was like. Anyway, the reason why it's thought to have been in Nara is because when she was buried in this enormous tomb, there is the oldest tomb burial that's been found is the Hashihaka tumulus, which is outside Nara. And it's keyhole shaped, like all these kofun. And the pots from inside have been radiocarbon dated to around 250 AD, which is her time.
Wow.
It could be her tomb, yeah.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And you can see that tomb, I suppose, right?
You can see it. You can go there. I mean, it just looks like all these tombs look like kind of wooded hills, but when you see them from above, you see the keyhole shape, which is really amazing. And as far as I know, the Imperial Household Agency doesn't allow archaeologists to look too deeply into these tombs in case it reveals something that counters the official history of Japan.
Sure, yeah.
So I don't know, but obviously it has been excavated because this is why they found these pots.
Continuing on this theme of these strong women and empresses in ancient Japan, and there was no problem with that.
There's 8 official empresses. I think the first one is Suiko, who was the empress who appointed her nephew Shotoku to be regent. So he's the famous one, but then again, that's a bit of male chauvinism. Apparently, Suiko also was fairly powerful. There's several famous ones. There's about seven or eight in all. One of the famous ones is Kogyoku, who was empress when her son, Prince Naka, had a really spectacular coup d'etat, which is shown actually in a woodblock print. He closed off the palace gates and warned the guards not to intervene. You weren't supposed to bring any weapons inside the palace. And he brought in a spear and he lopped off the head of the Soga chieftain. And the Soga had been kind of dominating the imperial family. And in this woodblock print, you can see the little head flying up into the air. It's quite funny. So he then took over. Even back then, way back then, even maybe in the case of Himiko, you always had the ruling person, but then you had the regent who perhaps had the actual power. I mean, so it's said that Himiko's brother conducted temporal affairs, but it's also said that Himiko issued laws. And then the same empress, Kogyoku, she had to abdicate immediately because to be in the presence of death was obviously polluting. So she abdicated, and her brother then came in as emperor, and Prince Naka, her son, was the one who really had the power. But later on, she took power back. She took another name. So then she counts as another empress, and she was called Empress Saimei. So she actually led the troops when their allied kingdom of Baekje, which is one of the parts of Korea, was under attack by China. And she led her army down to Kyushu and was actually about to lead the troops into battle. But then she died, so she didn't do that. So that shows that she was a strong empress. And then the other famous one was a few emperors and empresses down the line. She was called Emperor Koken, and she was the daughter of Emperor Shomu, who was the one who built the great Buddha in Nara. But at that point, the Fujiwara had come up, and they were the dominant clan. So again, they were trying to hang on to the reins of power, but she was still powerful. And she had a favorite called Dokyo, who was a sort of Rasputin, who was a kind of ascetic priest, and she was very fond of him. And one of the Fujiwara led an uprising, and she led the troops into battle against him, and he was executed. So she was that strong. But then, because she had been very much taken over by Dokyo, who was this Rasputin. It's a long story, but basically he decided he was going to be emperor, and that was beyond the pale because he was not a member of the correct family. So everything was fine until the empress died. And after she died, Dokyo was sent into exile. And the Fujiwara, who really wanted to get hold of the reins of power properly, then decreed that henceforth emperors would only be men. That was the moment, and that would have been around 800. I think there were still a couple of empresses in the Edo period, probably. I don't know at that point, but they came in because there was nobody else. So, so the period of strong empresses was from Himiko through till about 800 AD.
You know, women are fairly quiet until the Edo period and then the Meiji Restoration, and then after the Meiji Restoration, when Japan started embracing everything Western, and we enter the Taisho period, I guess that was, 1912?
Yeah.
Japan had its own women's movement, which I don't think most people even know, because they think of Japan as being a place that doesn't really praise women so much for their efforts. But I think in the Taisho, there was really a feminist movement going on there. Asano Akiko and Hiratsuka Raicho, right, who had the Blue Stocking magazine, Seito. For that time, these women were out there. Can you tell us about them?
I just would like to take a step back before we talk about that, because in the Edo period, it was said by Louis Frois, the Portuguese Jesuit, who was friends with Oda Nobunaga. He compared European and Japanese women. This is a long time ago. And in 1585, he said, Japanese women don't have to worry about being virgins. Nobody cares. He also said Japanese women could own property, go where they pleased, have abortions, and divorce their husbands. And he compared them to Portuguese women who did not have those freedoms. Then when you have the Meiji Restoration, then you have the Meiji Constitution, which says women have to be good wives, wise mothers. So that's a step back. It's not a step forward. It's a step back. And women, then you have all these magazines about, domesticity and so on. Okay, then you get to Taisho.
That was very interesting. Thank you.
Of course, then, the Meiji era, people had focused on how to kind of move the nation forward, but by Taisho, it's been moved forward. And there's been a couple of generations have gone by. So it's the grandchildren of the people that brought about the Meiji Restoration. And now they're actually taking on board lots of Western stuff like individualism, being yourself, doing your own thing. So then you have the Moga, who are the modern garu, the modern girls who are flappers, and they smoke cigarettes and they practice free love. It's probably a bit like what we do down here in London is not the same as goes on up north. And similarly, probably that went on in Tokyo, but that's not to say it went on all over the country. It probably didn't. So it's more the sort of, this real city girls who had that sort of life, which also Tanizaki wrote about in one of his novels. These kind of rather scary liberated women. Anyway, to go back to Hiratsuko Raicho, I mean, she said that marriage was slavery during the daytime and prostitution at night. That was what she said. And she eloped with this married guy called Morita Sohei. And when they eventually ended up back in Tokyo, Natsume Soseki said, you should marry him. And she was really annoyed. How dare he say she should marry him? She didn't. And she then created Seto, which was Blue Stocking, which was Japan's first literary work written by and for women. And it was published in September 1911 was the first issue. And the first words are, in the beginning, woman was the sun, because it was, of course, Amaterasu. It was this, woman was the sun. And there were lots of sort of stories about women's sexuality. A lot of people thought it was extremely shocking. One was on the breakup of an arranged marriage. One was someone writing about casual sex with some bloke she met in a tavern. And people found this is not proper. She and her fellow writers were dubbed new women. And that was supposed to be a criticism, but they thought, no, this is cool. We are new women. But of course, what the government objected to was that they criticized the capitalist system. Mm-hmm. They criticized the political order, and they demanded women's rights. And so the Home Ministry actually forbade distributors to supply the magazine. And so then, of course, it closed down. But she then became a political activist, and she went on right through to the Vietnam era. She was still an activist. I think she was 80-something when she died. And all this time she was fighting for women's rights. And women initially were banned from attending political meetings. She got that law overturned. And eventually, as you know, after the war, women finally got the vote. She lived with a much younger lover. And if you married, you had to take your husband's surname. And she said, no way was she going to do this. So they didn't get married. And then she had 2 children. And eventually, I think when her son was an adult, she thought it might be not good for him if he didn't have his father's surname. So she finally married this younger bloke when her children were adults. So she was quite a rebel. Yes.
And of course, everyone knows Yosano Akiko, right? She was also quite the rebel, had 13 children, lived with her lover, and she wrote a lot of poetry.
Yeah, she wrote tanka. She wrote, quite outspoken sort of poems about passion, poems about being a woman, poems about her body. And then she also wrote Thou Shalt Not Die, which is the very famous poem she wrote when her brother went off to war to fight in the Russo-Japanese War. But also she was afraid, they were all going to get killed for a war that she thought was stupid.
Yeah.
So this poem, she then had a whole change of heart and ended up supporting the Japanese government when they invaded Manchuria. All of that, which is difficult to understand, but whatever, she did that. But even so, her poem, Thou Shalt Not Die, became the anthem actually of the anti-war movement of later generations.
I'll try to find that poem and then I'll put it in the show notes. So lastly, I'd like to talk about your writing career. Not many writers span so many genres as you have and have managed to do it successfully. So tell me, how did you get into writing novels?
I've always tried to bring my stories alive. And I've always tried to bring my people alive. I've just, I love writing. I love the act of writing. And even when I wrote The Brothers way back, I tried to tell that as a story with living characters. And my agent kept saying to me that I should try fiction. And I thought, well, that would be, I could do, but it would involve probably writing a proposal and several chapters without knowing that any publisher would take them. And that's quite hard to do. Then what happened was that I got married, and that meant probably I was going to do less traveling than I had, and I wasn't going to hang around in Japan as much as I had, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I said to my husband, supposing I didn't earn any money for a year or two, and he had a job, he's a professor, and he said that was fine. So basically, I had that space and time and that kind of settled down situation that I could just sit down and I could do that. And I wrote my proposal and 4 chapters without knowing if a publisher would take them. And the publisher took them.
So there are 4 books in the Shogun Quartet series, right?
So the Shogun Quartet is The Shogun's Queen, The Last Concubine, The Samurai's Daughter, which is I initially called Across a Bridge of Dreams, but they decided it should be called The Samurai's Daughter, and The Courtesan and the Samurai. Each of them is a very specific historic period, and I had a lot of fun researching those historical periods. I love history, so it was obvious that I was going to end up writing the history of Japan in a way. But so the Shogun's Queen is about the moment when Commodore Perry arrives. It's about that complete sort of horrific, overturning of everything by Perry sailing in with his 4 black ships with their, great big cannons, very frightening. So that's the Shogun's Queen. Then The Last Concubine is actually focusing on the women's palace, which was the Oku. It's actually the Shogun's harem. I know harem's the wrong, it's an anachronistic term, but rather like the women's palace in Japan, a real harem too is full of powerful women. They're not all busy having sex with the potentate, far from it. It's a huge kind of bureaucracy of women, and that's what the women's palace was. So I really enjoyed researching the women's palace, and that is The Last Concubine. And then the next one is actually The Courtesan and the Samurai. And that one is about the last stand of the Tokugawa supporters who got this fantastic ship from Holland, sailed it back to Japan, and discovered that although the shogun had paid for it, but at that point the shogun had been toppled, and so the new government wanted their ship and they refused to give it up, and they sailed to Hokkaido. So I went up to Hakodate to research that, which was great. And then the last one is The Samurai's Daughter, which is the story of Saigo's last stand, which again I find very moving, I must say.
Saigo Takamori, yeah.
Yeah, Saigo Takamori.
Wow. Well, you've also done a few books on geisha, right?
Yes. The book on geisha I researched and wrote in 1999, 2000. And that was when I was living in Kyoto, living among geisha, I would say, which was very interesting. And also, I found geisha very impressive. They're fantastic women. They're unbelievable. They're strong, single women who make their living by their own skills and their own art. And they are also they're very stern. So like I would find that, ordinary Japanese women are always very nice to me. They're so kind. Of course, they're lovely. They're really kind to me. Geisha are not kind. If my polite Japanese was not right, they told me. And there was a key thing that I wrote about in my book, which was I was wooing this elderly geiko in Kyoto, and I gave her some cakes, and there was only one sort of cake that you give, and I hadn't got that. I didn't know that. And she kind of put it aside with incredible contempt. And I then did a lot of research, and I found the correct cakes, and I took them. And again, she's very stern. She said, very good. And then of course, she didn't open them up because you don't open them up, but she took the cakes. And she still didn't introduce me to anybody after all of that. So all my research, I'd made the discovery that all the people I thought would be helpful were not at all helpful.
Right.
And then other people I thought, well, I'll just try this person, probably a waste of time. They would be fantastic. And the big breakthrough, if I might just say, the big breakthrough was when I had been living in this little old house in Miyagawa-cho, which when I got there, I didn't even realize was actually one of the 5 geisha districts, which of course it is. And I would go to this very nice coffee shop that had great coffee in the morning, and I'd sit there writing my diary. And I'm quite an introverted sort of person, so I didn't talk to anybody. I just sat there, wrote my diary, talked to the lady serving me the coffee. And in this coffee shop, there were lots of other women with some with their hair in rollers, some of them in their nightgowns, some of them, wearing blouses and skirts. They're reading the paper. I'm reading something in English. They're reading something. We're all ignoring each other. We're all having our breakfast and toast. And about 2 months went by, and the coffee shop lady said to me, "Didn't you say you're writing a book about geisha?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "So why don't you interview these women here? They're all geisha." I said, "Oh, okay." And by then, I'd done it the Japanese way. I hadn't been pushy. I'd just been there. And they all knew me at that point. We said, "Ohayo gozaimasu," So then they came up to me, and one of them, an old lady, she said, "Well, why don't you come over?" So I went over to her, and so that was when the door really opened. It was that.
So your first book, if I'm not mistaken, was On the Narrow Road to the Deep North, A Journey into a Lost Japan. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And that was released in 1989, and you traveled in the footsteps of the poet Matsuo Basho. And so many people have read it. And then I do believe it's going to be re-released.
Yeah, it's coming out on October the 5th in England. It's an Eland edition. It was a great trip, basically. And it was early days for me. I went to Japan in 1978, and I'd been there for 5 years, and I then came back to England, and I realized there was something I hadn't done that I'd wanted to do. Somehow when you're living somewhere, you just get caught up in life and you forget. And back in England, I thought, damn it, I'd always really wanted to follow Basho's path. So anyway, that was the beginning of it.
Well, in the beginning of the book, you talk about this Japanese couple, at any rate, takes you in their car and they take you to Iga.
I was living in Gifu. I lived in Gifu, which is, as you know, it's on the very cusp it's dead at the heart of Japan. It's where the East Japan Yakuza have shootouts with the West Japan Yakuza, very famous, on a road called Yanagase. We're very proud of that in Gifu. And I was the first gaijin in Gifu City.
Really?
Yeah, there were two others, but I didn't find them for months and months. And there was a big fuss made when I appeared. So I was in various Gifu newspapers. There were articles about me. And a couple wrote to me and they said, Dear Lesley, we live in Iga Ueno. We have 2 children. We would like to expose them to foreigners. Would you like to come and stay? I said, yeah, why not? So
absolutely, what a great opportunity.
Yeah, so I went to Iga Ueno and I stayed with them. They were very nice and they had 2 children. They took me all over the place, but they took me to Basho's little house. Basho was born in Iga Ueno, and there is a theory that Basho was a ninja because Iga Ueno is the home of the ninja.
Yeah.
And the big question is, how did he travel so quickly? So there's all this whole mystery about, was he really a ninja? Was he a spy? Was he a spy for the shogunate? Anyway, there's all of that. But my whole interest in Japan, way, way back, I mean, one of the big things that sparked it was when I read the Penguin Anthology of Japanese Literature.
Right, lovely, lovely book.
And I read it from cover to cover, and it is absolutely fantastic, and I recommend everybody to read it. It's, it's Japanese literature in translation, and Basho was there, and I read it with it was so wonderful. So there I met Genji. I fell in love with Genji, as one does. I read the amazing Japanese poetry, which I adore, and I met Basho. The thing with haiku is, because they're quite little. So even if your reading and writing is not very good, to say the least, which mine isn't, you can still get to read the actual haiku as opposed to reading the translation. You can read it and you can feel it. But I also wrote down haiku. And so that was the sort of beginning, thinking, well, if I did follow Basho's path, but I could put all the explaining into my story, and then I could translate the haiku incredibly crisply, almost word for word. So that was what I was thinking. So then I set off. And of course, by then I was also in love with Yoshitsune already. And Basho was following Yoshitsune's path.
So this is a great introduction into the next question, which I always ask my interviewees what their favorite 3 books on Japan are. And I know it's going to be really difficult to narrow it down to 3, but just, pick any 3 that have affected you in some way with a sentence or 2 about why.
Number 1 would be one of the diaries written by early visitors to Japan, people like Ernest Sato, and Algernon Mitford,
Mhm.
but I thought I would go for Henry Houston, who was Townsend Harris's secretary. And he was a handsome young Dutchman who arrived in Japan with Townsend Harris in 1858 and absolutely adored Japan and wrote things like, he's on horseback galloping past Mount Fuji. And you go, oh, Mount Fuji, it's so wonderful. And then he sees, the crowds gathering to see them. They're the first foreigners that have ever been, out and about, apart from the Dutch. And then he had a very tragic end. It was in Edo when the Japanese had got really fed up with these foreigners. He was cut down. He was 29.
Mhm.
Anyway, he has this fantastic diary. I think everybody should read Henry Houston's diary. Again, thinking about it, there's a really wonderful book called As We Saw Them,
Oh,
which is the first Japanese embassy to America.
oh, wow.
Yeah, it's about the 1860 embassy that went to America. And they're all of course, they're in their samurai clothes. Why not? Of course they are.
Mhm.
And they went in barouches down Broadway. And they also did things like they'd be smoking. This is 1860. They're smoking. And they're thinking, oh, my God, what do I do with the ash? Because there's no papers. Where's the papers that you put the ash in? They didn't know about ashtrays. So this is Fukuzawa Yukichi was one of these, and he wrote about it. But so he put his ash into his kimono sleeve, and then his kimono sleeve started smoking. Oh my God, my kimono's on fire. Anyway, and this is about how they saw America, and it compares that with how Townsend Harris and Henry Houston were writing about Edo that they were seeing right then.
Mhm.
So there's the different ways of looking at these foreign countries in 1860. It's a fantastic book. And my last choice, because I read it not very long ago and I adored it, is Taiko by Yoshikawa Eiji,
Mhm.
which is the story of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And I was researching this period and I looked up Taiko on Amazon. It says it says look inside. And I looked inside, I read the first paragraph and I thought, I have to have this.
Mhm.
So gripping. It's an unbelievably colourful, it's 1,000 pages long. And I'd be reading it in bed at night and my poor husband trying to read his book and going, you won't believe what just happened. And it's so exciting.
That is wonderful. Okay. And I will write all those book names down in the show notes so that people can take a look at them. I certainly will, I know. Thank you very much for joining us. Be sure to check out Lesley Downer's new book, The Shortest History of Japan, available on Amazon and your favorite bookstore, including Asia Book Room and the ACT, where I picked it up. And just a real pleasure to have you on the show today. After like 30 years of publishing, I finally get to talk to you, and it's been really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast. Produced and edited by Amy Chavez and Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your podcast host, Amy Chavez, author of Amy's Guide to Best Behavior in Japan and The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, Discovering a Lost Way of Life on a Secluded Japanese Island. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.